It was a warm June evening in 1989 when Jonathan Michael Hale and Rebecca Lynn Hale left their modest home in Los Lunas, New Mexico, with the easy confidence of a couple who had just begun building their life together. Jonathan, a civil engineer with a quiet ambition, had spent the last year immersed in projects that slowly earned him recognition in his field, while Rebecca, a warm, vivacious schoolteacher, had just finished her second year at Los Lunas Elementary School, adored by colleagues and students alike. They had married the previous July, a small ceremony attended by family and close friends, and their life together was peaceful but filled with the quiet excitement of shared plans, vacations, career moves, a home to decorate, dreams to chase. Before diving in, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest cold case stories. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from right now. The evening of June 17th had been uneventful up until that point. Jonathan had insisted they try Los Lunas' newest restaurant, a modest but well-regarded establishment known for its southwestern cuisine and casual, welcoming atmosphere. They arrived just after 7, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows across the streets. Inside, the place hummed with conversation, the occasional clatter of dishes, and the low tones of a guitar being strummed by a lone musician in the corner. They were seated by a window overlooking the street, a prime vantage point for a quiet couple who liked to watch the world go by as they ate. Jonathan had ordered the grilled flank steak, Rebecca a chicken enchilada, and for a few minutes they shared stories from the day, laughed at inside jokes, and sipped their drinks. The warmth of the restaurant, combined with the comfort of each other's company, made the night feel ordinary, yet perfectly intimate. They had no inkling of the darkness that would soon interrupt the ordinariness of their lives. It was only after Jonathan excused himself to use the restroom that a subtle disturbance in the atmosphere caught Rebecca's attention. Across the restaurant, near the back corner, a man had been lingering, seated alone at a table, but watching more than he appeared to. There was something persistent in the way his eyes darted toward her whenever she shifted in her seat, a lingering awareness that made her skin crawl ever so slightly. He was clean-cut but nondescript, dressed in a casual shirt and slacks, blending in with the crowd. No one would have noticed him, and yet Rebecca felt an instinctive unease, an intuition that told her she wasn't alone in the room. She brushed it off, telling herself it was her imagination. After all, she had seen strange looks in restaurants before, odd glances at a table, nothing more. But the feeling lingered, a quiet hum at the edge of her consciousness. When Jonathan returned, they finished their meals, paid the bill, and stepped out into the evening air. The streets of Los Lunas were still and calm, the smell of juniper and desert heat mingling as they walked to their car, a well-maintained 1986 Ford Taurus, parked near the curb. The night had begun innocuously, as it often did, with a sense of freedom and possibility that comes from a quiet, ordinary town in the high desert. They drove along Route 47, a 2-lane road that curved past low mesas and scrubland, the kind of road that felt long and open even at night. Rebecca hummed along to the radio, Jonathan's hand steady on the wheel, the conversation light and playful. And yet, as they rounded a gentle bend near Cedar Lake Reservoir, a shadow appeared behind them. A set of headlights that seemed unusually close, too close. The headlights lingered, following the curves of the road, mimicking their speed. Jonathan noticed it in his peripheral vision, a twinge of concern, but the other vehicle stayed at a distance, not aggressive yet unnerving in its persistence. Rebecca glanced at him. "Do you see that car back there?" she asked, trying to mask the worry in her voice. Jonathan's jaw tightened slightly. "Yeah," he replied. His tone measured, but calm. "Probably just someone heading home. Route 47 isn't exactly crowded, but people do drive late." Still, the feeling of unease grew. The car behind them remained too close, too attentive. A few minutes later, just past the last curve before the Cedar Lake access road, the vehicle drew alongside them, its engine humming too loudly in the night. The driver's attention was palpable, though no words were exchanged, just a presence that seemed deliberate. Jonathan instinctively slowed, staying alert, careful. He had no reason to panic yet, but his mind started calculating possibilities, running through the unlikely scenarios, weighing the options in the way a practical man trained in problem-solving might. Then came the abrupt, unnatural bump. The Taurus swerved as something nudged the rear quarter panel, just enough to throw it slightly off its lane. Jonathan corrected the wheel, heart pounding, trying to maintain control. Another nudge, then a third, this time deliberate, forceful enough that the car skidded toward the shoulder. Rebecca gasped as the vehicle fishtailed slightly before settling into the soft dirt of the embankment near the reservoir. The headlights behind them flashed in the mirror before vanishing briefly into the night, only to reappear as a silhouette. The couple tried to regain composure, Jonathan attempting to start the car again, but the vehicle hesitated. The tires had kicked up loose gravel, and the faint hum of engine trouble made him uneasy. The night air was heavy, silent aside from the occasional rustle of wind through scrub and the faint lapping of water at the edge of the reservoir. Then the first blow came, sudden and violent, a hand, a tool, a weight. It was impossible to tell in the chaos, striking Jonathan across the side. He stumbled, struggled, instinctively shielding Rebecca. Another strike hit, and the world narrowed to panic, fear, and a desperate attempt to survive. The details after that became fragmented, broken. Forensic evidence would later reveal the physical trauma, but in that moment, the couple's world ended in the darkness near Cedar Lake. The car, pushed and guided by forces unknown to witnesses at the time, slipped from the embankment and into the water. The Taurus disappeared beneath the reservoir's surface with a muffled splash, the night reclaiming it as if it had never been there at all. It wasn't until the next morning that the alarm sounded. Jonathan's parents, Mark and Evelyn Hale, arrived at the house, noting the car's absence and the lack of any note or message. Calls to friends and co-workers went unanswered, and by late morning, a missing person report had been filed with the Valencia County Sheriff's Office. Deputies and local volunteers began searching the streets, the desert edges, and the small trails leading to Cedar Lake, hoping to find some trace of the couple or their vehicle. The search was methodical but ultimately fruitless. No tire tracks indicated where the car might have gone, no abandoned belongings, no witness statements beyond distant glimpses of headlights the night before. Sheriff's logs recorded the effort with meticulous care. Patrols canvassed the Route 47 corridor, residents were questioned, boats combed the reservoir, and divers were summoned in the event of a submerged vehicle. Yet the investigation ran into immediate limitations. Technology in 1989 could only do so much. There was no DNA database, forensic analysis of the vehicle was primitive at best, and the dark water of Cedar Lake had concealed all but the vaguest evidence. The logs noted the frustration of the officers. The vehicle was gone, the bodies unaccounted for, and there was no trail to follow. As days turned into weeks, the Hale family grappled with the unknown. Every ringing phone was a potential messenger of bad news. Every unmarked car passing the driveway seemed a threat or a clue. The community, too, felt the void. Los Lunas had known the couple. Friends, neighbors, teachers, and engineers were all deeply affected. Candlelight vigils were held at the edge of the reservoir, the water's dark surface reflecting flickering lights and quiet prayers for answers that would not come. Meanwhile, inside the sheriff's office, the investigators documented each lead, no matter how minor, each report and tip meticulously logged. Officers revisited the restaurant, interviewed employees and patrons, reviewed road conditions, and mapped out the area in detail. But all the efforts returned the same result. The couple had vanished without trace. The absence of evidence became a defining frustration of the early investigation. Friends of the Hales recalled seeing them leave Los Lunas that night, their normal routines unchanged, their spirits light. But the suddenness of their disappearance cast a shadow over the ordinary streets of Route 47. Residents would later recount an eerie stillness along the road, a place where, for a fleeting moment, the night seemed heavier, more watchful. Mark Hale, Jonathan's father, spent countless nights driving along the route, flashlight in hand, tracing the paths his son might have taken. Evelyn Brooks, Rebecca's mother, combed local news, posting flyers, calling every friend and family member, each day steeped in worry. Their grief was compounded by uncertainty, There was no body, no scene, no closure. Investigators explained the limits of forensic science at the time, noting that even if a vehicle had been found, it would have been nearly impossible to extract the kind of evidence that modern technology could provide decades later. Months passed. Early spring brought a faint sense of routine back into the town, but the case remained open. Officers rotated through the investigation, new leads were pursued, but always ended in dead ends. Jonathan and Rebecca's story became a ghost in Los Lunas, referenced quietly in conversations, recalled at random when a neighbor remembered seeing the couple in the supermarket or at a local fair months before the disappearance. They were alive in memory but absent in reality. By the end of the first year, the Hale case had settled into what investigators would quietly refer to as a cold file. Reports documented every lead, every tip, every search effort, meticulously bound into folders that filled cabinets in the Valencia County Sheriff's Office. The initial flurry of activity had waned, replaced by a cautious hope among the families that perhaps, someday, new evidence might emerge. But for the time being, Jonathan and Rebecca Hale had vanished into the desert night. Their Ford Taurus swallowed by the depths of Cedar Lake Reservoir, leaving behind nothing but questions, grief, and the persistent ache of not knowing. And though no suspect had been identified, there were whispers in the town. A vehicle glimpsed lingering near Los Lunas that night. A shadow that seemed too attentive, too deliberate. The faintest hints that someone had been watching, waiting. Someone who would not be seen again. At least not for decades. For the families, friends, and community, the night of June 17, 1989, remained frozen in memory. Jonathan and Rebecca Hale had left for dinner and simply disappeared. No struggle had been reported, no scream heard. Just an absence that would haunt every holiday, every anniversary, every moment that marked the passage of time. The early investigators did what they could. They followed every lead, exhausted every resource available, but the limitations of the time worked against them. No forensic breakthroughs existed, no databases to cross-reference unknown DNA or vehicle evidence. The case became a stark illustration of how easily a disappearance could remain hidden in plain sight, how the ordinary landscape of streets, restaurants, and reservoirs could conceal an extraordinary crime. As the years would pass, the Hale case would linger in the collective memory of Los Lunas and Valencia County. It would become a cautionary tale, referenced in whispers and newspaper articles, a story of two young lives that vanished, leaving families desperate for closure. And for the audience now learning of it, the question would remain, what happened to Jonathan and Rebecca Hale that night? Who was watching? And could the truth still surface decades later from the dark, quiet waters of Cedar Lake Reservoir? If this story has captured your attention so far, and you want to follow the investigation as it unfolds, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what comes next as we uncover the chilling details and unexpected breakthroughs in this decades-old mystery. The years after June 1989 passed with a cruel, lingering weight for the Hale family. Mark Hale, Jonathan's younger brother, threw himself into advocacy for missing persons, attending support groups, distributing flyers, and speaking at community gatherings whenever possible. He learned to navigate the bureaucracy of law enforcement and nonprofit organizations, constantly reminding himself that someone, somewhere, might hold the missing pieces that could bring Jonathan and Rebecca home. Every holiday, every birthday, every small victory or heartbreak, he thought of them. Always. Evelyn Brooks, Rebecca's mother, had tried to rebuild her life, but grief clung to her like a shadow. Even as she laughed with her grandchildren or tended her rose garden, her mind would drift to that night in June. She'd walk past the corner of Route 47 and see the empty stretch of road as if it were frozen in time, the ghost of her daughter's laughter carried away by the wind. Meanwhile, life moved forward in the small towns of Valencia County and Belen, New Mexico. The world outside the Hale family's grief changed. Technology evolved, communities grew, and new families were born. But in the quiet corners of the county, certain patterns remained unchanged, unnoticed by most. Bars and diners still bustled with conversation. People went to work and returned home, and some men, outwardly ordinary, quietly nursed dark obsessions that the world would never see. Thomas Ray Nolan was one such man. Born in 1962 in Belen, New Mexico, Nolan was the middle child of 3. His father worked in construction. His mother managed the household with quiet authority. On the surface, he seemed like any other kid growing up in the 1970s, a little mischievous, a little stubborn, but there was an edge to him, a temper that could flare over the smallest slights. Teachers often described him as bright, capable, but restless, prone to arguments with classmates, sometimes physical. By the time Nolan reached adulthood, his volatility had developed alongside an outwardly polite charm. He could smile, shake hands, and befriend nearly anyone, while beneath the surface, anger simmered like a dormant storm. Nolan's early adult years were marked by small but increasingly frequent incidents. A bar fight here, a heated argument there, a domestic dispute that escalated just far enough to make a mark on his record. In 1982, he had a run-in outside a tavern in Belen that left a man with a broken jaw and a hospital bill, earning Nolan his first serious brush with the law. In 1986, a minor DUI added another layer of legal scrutiny, and by the late 1980s, law enforcement began to recognize a pattern. Nolan could appear ordinary, even pleasant, but when provoked, or when desire and obsession converged, he became dangerous. Yet, despite these incidents, Nolan's public persona remained carefully curated. He lived alone in a modest house on Cedar Street, kept his lawn meticulously mowed, and often helped neighbors with repairs or errands. He worked as a construction foreman for a local firm, commanding respect for his efficiency and attention to detail. To the world, he was reliable, quiet, perhaps even trustworthy. Nobody suspected that beneath that calm exterior, he harbored a fixation that would one day intersect with the lives of Jonathan and Rebecca Hale. In the years following the couple's disappearance, Nolan maintained a low profile, though he occasionally frequented the same diners and bars where the Hales had been seen before their disappearance. The Los Lunas restaurant, where Jonathan and Rebecca had celebrated their anniversary and last night out, remained a touchstone in the community. Nolan visited the diner sporadically, sometimes alone, sometimes with a co-worker, always polite, always careful. And yet, those who remembered the couple reported feeling an unsettling unease around him, something just beyond recognition, a subtle energy that didn't quite align with his smile. Back in Valencia County, the Hale and Brooks families refused to let the case fade into silence. Flyers were posted on street corners, community boards, and schools. Every tip, every rumor was followed up on, often only to lead to disappointment. A local man reported seeing a car matching the Hales' description on a remote road near Cedar Lake Reservoir years after their disappearance, only for investigators to find that memory unreliable. A truck seen near Los Lunas was traced to a traveling salesman with an alibi. Frustration mounted as the trail grew colder with each passing year, leaving families in a limbo of uncertainty, where hope battled despair in equal measure. Mark Hale, particularly, carried the weight of responsibility with him. He checked in with law enforcement periodically, pushing for attention to cold cases, and attended conferences for families of missing persons. He became a fixture in community advocacy, sharing Jonathan and Rebecca's story, reminding everyone that behind every missing person report was a living, breathing human being with dreams, relationships, and loved ones left behind. Evelyn Brooks kept a journal of every anniversary, every fleeting lead, and every news article she could find that might mention the couple. The emotional toll was staggering, but she refused to stop searching in her own way. Meanwhile, Nolan's life unfolded in a parallel trajectory of outward normalcy and inward obsession. He lived quietly, kept his work steady, and interacted with neighbors politely. Yet there were hints, small and easily overlooked, of his lingering preoccupation with the Hale case. Old newspapers were clipped, photographs memorized, anniversaries noted silently. He never spoke of his interest openly, never drew attention to himself, but every move was deliberate. Every day was carefully calibrated, every action measured to avoid suspicion. He was a ghost in plain sight, perfectly ordinary to anyone who passed him on the street, yet meticulously documenting the lives and the grief of the family whose tragedy he had caused. Life in Valencia County carried on, with families, townsfolk, and law enforcement maintaining routines. Bars, like the Rusty Nail analog, continued to operate, the smell of fried food and cigarettes lingering in the air, and the clink of glasses marking another evening's passage. Nolan was present in these spaces, inconspicuous, blending into the background of laughter and conversation. Occasionally, patrons remembered him as quiet, helpful even, but something about his attention to detail, how he observed couples, how he lingered when he thought no one was looking, hinted at an intensity that went unnoticed at the time. Decades passed. The Hale case became one of the region's lingering mysteries. Law enforcement kept the files in cold storage, only periodically reviewing them as technology slowly advanced. The Hale's families refused to stop looking, holding on to hope that some small break, some overlooked clue, could bring resolution. Mark Hale remained persistent, attending community forums, supporting new advocacy programs, and connecting with families in similar positions. Evelyn Brooks continued to advocate, participating in local support groups and sharing her daughter's story, reminding people that behind every statistic was a real life, a family, a story that deserved attention. In 2018, the climate began to play an unexpected role. Drought conditions in Valencia County left the water levels in Cedar Lake Reservoir unusually low. Fishers reported new islands of mud emerging, shoreline rocks jutting above the surface, and odd, rusted shapes becoming visible in previously submerged areas. Local residents noticed the unusual water conditions, but few grasped the significance. Yet, in quiet corners, a few people began to speak of seeing things, glints of metal in the mud, reflections that seemed out of place, evidence that had been hiding for decades. One evening in the late summer of 2019, Daniel Moreno, a lifelong fisherman, arrived at Cedar Lake before sunrise. He carried his gear and settled in at a familiar spot along the northern edge. The water, unusually low, revealed stretches of mud that hadn't been exposed in living memory. Moreno's practiced eyes scanned the surface, noting the textures, the patterns in the silt, the movement of fish. But then he saw something that made him pause, a rectangular glint of metal partially embedded in the mud. At first, he thought it might be a forgotten fishing trap or a piece of debris. As he crouched to inspect it, his heart thumped. It looked like a vehicle license plate, but decades old, rusted, and half-buried. The discovery shook him. He knew instinctively that this was not ordinary trash. He called the local authorities, reporting what he had found. Valencia County Sheriff's Office dispatchers were skeptical at first. The drought had revealed strange objects in the past, and often they were nothing more than old construction debris or farm equipment. But Moreno was insistent. He described the size, shape, and partial visibility of the object. He mentioned that he had seen other strange protrusions in the surrounding mud. The dispatchers relayed the information up the chain, flagging it as a potential cold case lead. Meanwhile, the families of Jonathan and Rebecca were going about their daily lives, unaware that, after 30 years of silence, a faint glimmer of hope was emerging. Mark Hale was preparing a community fundraiser for missing persons awareness, reviewing old files, and contemplating the anniversaries that seemed to define the passage of time. Evelyn Brooks was arranging flowers in her garden, reflecting on the years lost, the birthdays uncelebrated, and the moments that would never return. Neither could know that a simple call from a fisherman could pivot their decades-long grief toward answers. In parallel, Nolan remained in Belen, oblivious to the stirrings around Cedar Lake. Yet, for anyone paying attention, the signs of obsession over the Hales case were quietly present in his life. Newspaper clippings tucked into boxes, personal notes, quiet reminders, anniversaries observed alone. To neighbors, he was just Thomas Nolan, a man of routine and polite manners. But those with a keener eye might notice the lingering gaze when anniversaries of the disappearance appeared in local news, or the subtle marking of days in his calendar that coincided with publicized events related to the Hales. The years of silence, the passage of time, and the quiet persistence of both families and nature itself were converging. While law enforcement had once lacked the tools to solve the mystery, no DNA analysis, no centralized database, limited forensic technology, The 21st century offered possibilities that had once been unimaginable. Experts could now extract genetic material from decades-old evidence, analyze paint transfers from vehicles long corroded, and cross-reference suspects' histories in ways that were impossible in 1989. Every rusted fragment, every overlooked witness, every memory stored in fading newspapers could now be re-evaluated with precision. And so, the stage was set. For 30 years, Jonathan and Rebecca's story had remained suspended in time. Their families had endured the unthinkable, carrying the burden of uncertainty, the ache of absence, and the hope that someday, somehow, the truth might surface. The drought, a fisherman's keen eyes, and the inexorable passage of time were about to ignite a chain of events that no one could have anticipated. Before the discovery, before the analysis, before the eventual breakthrough, the world seemed quiet, still, as if holding its breath. The reservoir, exposed and merciless in the summer sun, hid secrets in its muddy bed, waiting for the right moment, the right person to reveal them. If you've ever wondered what it's like to live with unanswered questions, to wait for decades for closure, imagine the Hale family, holding on to hope while the world moved on. Share their story, remember their names, and subscribe to follow every twist in this decades-long mystery. Because sometimes the smallest observation, the quietest detail, can change everything. It was late September 2021 when Cedar Lake Reservoir, nestled quietly in Valencia County, began revealing the secrets it had been holding for over 3 decades. A summer of unusually low rainfall had dropped water levels far below the usual mark, exposing muddy banks and shallow inlets that had been deep and undisturbed for years. Fishermen, kayakers, and hikers had begun noticing strange protrusions from the water, shadows beneath the ripples that didn't belong. Among them was a local fisherman, Daniel Martinez, who had grown up along the lake and knew every curve, every tree line, every log that sank just below the surface. That morning, he was out before sunrise, setting his lines along a small cove, when his eyes caught a strange glint reflecting in the low sunlight. Squinting, he realized it wasn't a rock or a piece of floating debris. The shape was unmistakably angular, metallic, and large. He radioed it in, at first almost laughing at himself for being overly cautious, but when deputies from the Valencia County Sheriff's Office arrived, the gravity of the discovery became clear. Within the hour, the site was cordoned off with bright yellow tape, and local law enforcement approached with a mix of curiosity and caution. When they finally got close, the dark outline beneath the murky water was revealed to be the roof of a submerged vehicle. Its paint had long since faded into mottled rust and algae, and parts of it had begun to collapse under decades of water and silt accumulation. News traveled fast. Valencia County hadn't seen a case like this in decades, and the families of Jonathan and Rebecca Hale, who had vanished one night in June 1989, had long held on to hope, clinging to memory and to the frustration of unanswered questions. When deputies called Mark Hale and Evelyn Brooks, the reactions were a mixture of disbelief and a raw, unfiltered grief that resurfaced as if it had been frozen in time. Mark's hands shook as he clutched the phone. "You're sure?" he asked, voice breaking. "Are you absolutely sure it's them?" The deputy hesitated, giving only what could be confirmed. A vehicle matching the description from the original reports had been discovered in the reservoir. Details about human remains were still preliminary, but even that was enough to send shockwaves through the family. Detective Lieutenant Maria Vasquez of the New Mexico State Police was assigned to oversee the recovery operation. She arrived on the scene with a small team of deputies and the county dive squad, familiar with the complexities of extracting decades-old evidence. Standing at the edge of the reservoir, she studied the vehicle, a 1987 Toyota Camry, rusted and partially submerged, the outline barely discernible beneath layers of algae and sediment. The water was shallow near the banks, which helped, but the years had not been kind. Windows were either shattered or missing entirely, and the roof had partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated debris. Vasquez felt the familiar chill of anticipation, the kind that came with a major cold case suddenly revealing itself after decades of silence. Divers suited up and entered the murky water. The scene was eerie, almost surreal. After decades, the vehicle seemed like a ghost from another time, resting silently, untouched, carrying within it the answers to a mystery that had haunted an entire community. With careful precision, the divers attached lifting straps to the car's frame. A heavy-duty winch on a flatbed truck slowly began pulling the Camry toward the shore. Each inch of progress revealed more damage: corroded metal flaking away, bent frames, shattered window remnants. But beneath it all was the unmistakable proof of its history: a license plate, barely legible through years of rust. The numbers and letters matched the original registration for Jonathan Hale's car, lost so long ago that many had begun to accept the possibility it would never be found. Once on solid ground, the forensic team began their work. Dr. Samuel Iqbal, a forensic anthropologist with years of experience in cold case recovery, surveyed the remains alongside Dr. Renee Calder, a forensic pathologist, and Lucas Meyer, a forensic technician. The skeletal remains had suffered decades of exposure to water, yet bones can tell stories long after soft tissues have vanished. Each fragment, each fracture, each pattern of wear and damage offered insight. The team documented everything meticulously, photographing each angle, measuring every detail, and carefully cataloging the bones to ensure no evidence would be lost in the handling. What became immediately clear was that these were not the injuries of an accident. The skull of Rebecca Hale showed a depressed fracture on the left temporal bone, a blunt force injury, likely delivered with intent. Jonathan Hale's ribcage bore multiple fractures, concentrated on the left side, consistent with repeated forceful blows. Dr. Calder explained to Vasquez that these injuries were perimortem, meaning they occurred around the time of death, but they were inconsistent with the type of trauma expected from a vehicle submersion or impact with the shallow reservoir. This was not a case of losing control on a dark road. This was interpersonal violence. Meanwhile, Lucas Meyer focused on the Camry itself. Years underwater had turned it into a fragile shell, but metal and paint can survive where organic material does not. He examined the rear driver's side panel, noting a compressed indentation. The pattern suggested that another vehicle had made contact with the Camry, hitting it from behind with enough force to push it off the road. Measurements and the height of the impact indicated a truck or large sedan. Traces of paint embedded in the crushed metal allowed Meyer to determine not only that another vehicle was involved, but potentially the make and model. Each scrape and transfer mark became a piece of the puzzle. Inside the vehicle, forensic specialists scoured every possible surface for biological traces. Seats had rotted away, dashboard materials disintegrated, and most organic matter was gone. But in the trunk, sealed in a plastic toolbox that had somehow remained watertight, they found an object of interest: a tire iron, rusted yet intact. Swabs revealed faint traces of blood, long degraded but not entirely lost to time. It would be a challenge, but modern DNA amplification techniques, methods unimaginable in 1989, offered a chance to recover usable genetic material. Dr. Lisa Tran, the lab's DNA specialist, took on the task. Extracting DNA from decades-old water-exposed evidence is like trying to read a manuscript left out in a storm for 32 years, she explained to the team. Some strands were hopelessly degraded, but with careful processing, even fragments could be amplified and compared to known profiles. After weeks of patient work, Dr. Tran returned with results that shook the investigation. The tire iron carried two contributors. One matched Rebecca Hale, confirming its connection to the victim. The other, a male not associated with Jonathan Hale, matched a profile in CODIS, a convicted offender database. For the first time, Vasquez felt the net tighten around a potential suspect. The evidence pointed to a single individual whose genetic material was undeniably at the scene. Paint transfer analysis further confirmed that the vehicle which collided with the Hale Camry was a 1985 Ford F-150, a model still in circulation in the county during the late 1980s. Every fragment of evidence, skeletal trauma, DNA, paint, tire marks, was converging to create a picture of a deliberate attack. While the forensic team worked on physical evidence, investigators revisited witness reports from the original 1989 case. Marjorie Keene, who had been a waitress at Los Lunas that night, recalled an unfamiliar man sitting in the corner, observing the couple as they dined. Dennis Alvarez, a passing motorist from that same evening, remembered seeing a dark-colored truck following a Camry along Route 47 before both vehicles disappeared from his view. Though these memories were decades old, the details aligned eerily with the forensic reconstruction. Through careful mapping of the route, investigators reconstructed the final moments of the Hales' drive. They left Los Lunas, traveling north along Route 47, the Camry's path traced meticulously with historical data and witness recollections. Somewhere near the Cedar Lake access road, the vehicle was forced off course, entering a stretch where trees and embankments obscured visibility. The following vehicle, likely the F-150, made contact, pushing the Camry down an embankment into the shallow waters of the reservoir. The tire iron, the perimortem fractures, and the patterns of paint transfer all supported this scenario. As the evidence mounted, Vasquez paused at the edge of the reservoir, looking out across the lake. For over 32 years, this water had held the Hales' story in silence. And now, the same lake that had swallowed the vehicle and the truth was giving it back, piece by piece. She turned to the team and said quietly, "Every detail matters. Every fragment matters. Someone will pay for this." The community, following updates through local news and social media, was riveted. Families, friends, and neighbors expressed disbelief and hope. Mark Hale and Evelyn Brooks, still grappling with the emotional weight of decades without closure, felt the long-suppressed anguish reawaken. But there was also a flicker of hope. Finally, the investigation was moving in a tangible direction. For viewers following the story online, Vasquez encouraged engagement in a subtle, guilt-based way. If you've ever watched a story like this unfold and felt the frustration of unanswered questions, now is the time to act. Subscribe and stay with us, because justice takes persistence, and sometimes silence lasts decades too long. The forensic team continued working into early 2023, running paint analysis through spectrometers, confirming the F-150 link, and cross-referencing DNA against national databases. The breakthrough came slowly but inevitably. Every piece corroborated the same narrative of deliberate action, of two lives cut short, and of a perpetrator who had eluded capture for decades. The case was no longer theoretical. The convergence of witness testimony, forensic breakthroughs, and modern investigative techniques had transformed a 32-year-old cold case into a live, actionable investigation. Thomas Ray Nolan, though still unknown to the public, was at the center of this growing storm. Every discovery at Cedar Lake Reservoir was a step closer to identifying the person responsible for the deaths of Jonathan and Rebecca Hale. By the end of 2023, investigators had reconstructed not just the crime, but the timeline leading to it, connecting the Hales' last known movements to the evidence now in the lab. The perimortem injuries told of the violence inflicted. The tire iron and paint transfer revealed the method and vehicle involved, and witness statements, decades old, confirmed the suspect's presence at key moments. All that remained was to bring the pieces together in a way that would allow law enforcement to confront the individual who had hidden behind decades of normalcy, a man who had lived unnoticed in Valencia County while the families of his victims waited in agony for answers. The story of Jonathan and Rebecca Hale, buried for over 32 years, was finally resurfacing. And as Vasquez and her team prepared for the next steps, one thought lingered in her mind. Justice may be delayed, but it can never be denied. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Detective Elena Morales parked her unmarked SUV across the street from the modest home on Willow Lane in Belen. The air was crisp for early May, carrying a hint of desert dust from the nearby mesas. Morales checked her team one last time, quietly signaling readiness. Behind them, a small caravan of law enforcement vehicles waited, lights muted, engines idling. Inside the house, Thomas Ray Nolan stirred as if he sensed nothing unusual, a cup of coffee warming in his hands. 42 years had passed since that night in 1989 when Jonathan and Rebecca Hale vanished without a trace, and Nolan had spent the intervening decades weaving a life so ordinary, so painstakingly mundane, that the town had long ceased to suspect the dark shadow beneath his calm facade. Morales and her team approached the front door with measured steps. Nolan opened it before they knocked, blinking sleep from his eyes. "Can I help you?" His voice was flat, devoid of inflection, casual, He looked like any man in his 60s. Thinning gray hair, glasses balanced on his nose, plaid shirt tucked into worn jeans, a belt with a simple buckle. His house was neat, minimal, with a small collection of hand tools neatly arranged on a pegboard in the garage and a single recliner facing the television in the living room. It was the kind of house that didn't draw attention, and that was exactly what made it dangerous. "You can," Morales said calmly, her voice steady but authoritative. "Thomas Nolan, you're under arrest for the murders of Jonathan Michael Hale and Rebecca Lynn Hale." Her words landed with an almost imperceptible pause, a breathless moment where time seemed to stretch. Nolan's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't move, didn't resist. For 42 years, he had lived under the illusion of safety, of invisibility, and now that illusion had shattered. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists with a metallic finality. Neighbors emerged, drawn by curiosity, their morning routines interrupted by the unusual flurry of activity. Some peered over fences, some whispered from porches, their expressions a mix of disbelief and fear. "I can't believe it," murmured Phyllis Garvey, who had lived across the street from Nolan for over a decade. "He helped me bring in groceries last week. Cheerful, polite, and all this time he—" Her voice trailed off. Disbelief etched into every line of her face. Inside the house, officers conducted a careful sweep, documenting everything. Nolan's life was Spartan. In the bedroom, under a plain bed, they discovered a small cardboard box. Inside were meticulously preserved newspaper clippings, yellowed with age, chronicling the Hale case over the years. Articles from 1989 detailing the initial disappearance. Follow-ups in 1990, the anniversary pieces from 1999 and 2009. The 2019 reports about the discovery of the submerged Toyota Camry in Cedar Lake Reservoir. Nolan had kept them like a collector preserves trophies, a silent acknowledgement of a crime that he had long believed to be forgotten. Morales ran her gloved fingers over the brittle paper, her stomach tightening. This wasn't just evidence, it was obsession. The investigation team pieced together the patterns of Nolan's decades-long ordinary life. He had worked consistently as a construction foreman, interacting politely with co-workers, occasionally lending a hand to neighbors with home repairs, maintaining a spotless lawn in front of his modest residence. Outwardly, he was unremarkable, almost invisible in the community. But the layers beneath that veneer were chilling. Past arrests revealed a pattern of violence. A bar fight in 1991 that left a man hospitalized. A DUI with assault in 2003, charges of domestic assault in 1995, often dismissed due to reluctant witnesses or minor procedural missteps. None of these incidents, isolated or seemingly small, hinted at the enormity of what he had done in 1989. And yet they formed the subtext of a personality that simmered with latent rage, obsessive tendencies, and a compulsive need for control. Morales and her team transported Nolan to the Valencia County Sheriff's Office for interrogation. He was calm on the ride, hands cuffed, posture upright, staring out the window at the desert landscape rolling by. His silence was unnerving, a void that seemed to swallow the room's tension. When he arrived, the team prepared the room meticulously. All available evidence from the forensic analysis of the Camry, DNA results from the tire iron, paint transfer linking a 1985 Ford F-150 to the vehicle, witness statements and trauma reports were compiled and presented with precision. Morales sat across from him, placing the folders in front of her. "We have the DNA from the tire iron," she said, her voice even but unwavering. "We have the paint analysis linking your truck to the Hale vehicle. Witnesses place you at Los Lunas that night, and re-interviews confirm you were near Cedar Lake Reservoir. We know what you did, Thomas. You can make this easier on yourself. You can give the Hale family the answers they've waited decades for. Or you can stay silent and let them relive every second of the nightmare you caused." She paused, letting her words sink in. Nolan's expression didn't change. He didn't flinch, didn't speak. Only his eyes betrayed the faintest trace of calculation, as if weighing the weight of 42 years against a single moment of truth. The families, meanwhile, were receiving updates from the sheriff's office. Mark Hale and Evelyn Brooks, Jonathan and Rebecca's parents, had been notified that the suspect had been taken into custody. Emotions ran high. Mark's hands trembled as he gripped the phone. Hearing Morales' words confirm what decades of hope and despair had led to. 42 years, he whispered to himself, a mix of grief, relief, and rage swirling in his chest. Evelyn wept quietly in the corner of her kitchen, thinking of the evening spent driving around Valencia County, calling every hospital, checking every missing person report, and holding on to the hope that somehow, somewhere, her children were alive. The reality was unbearable, yet now, after decades of uncertainty, there was a man in custody who had orchestrated the worst night of their lives. At the press conference later that morning, DA Cynthia Morales spoke to a crowded room. Cameras flashed, microphones leaned forward. "Today," she began, "we are taking a significant step toward justice for Jonathan and Rebecca Hale. Thomas Ray Nolan has been formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. This case has haunted our community for over 40 years. While nothing can erase the suffering caused, it is a reminder that time does not diminish accountability." The room buzzed with murmurs. Journalists scribbled notes, live streams captured every detail, and outside, community members whispered in disbelief. A man who had lived among them quietly, politely, even helpfully, had harbored unspeakable violence behind closed doors. Morales reflected on the subtle but persistent pieces of evidence that had led to this moment. The drought that had lowered the water level at Cedar Lake Reservoir, revealing the Camry's roof just barely above the surface. The careful, painstaking forensic work, sifting through decades of sediment, extracting degraded DNA from the tire iron, analyzing paint transfer that linked the Hale vehicle to Nolan's truck. Every witness re-interviewed, every prior investigation log re-examined. Small details overlooked in 1989 now proved critical, their significance magnified by modern technology and human persistence. Without the foresight of those who never gave up, Detective Samuel Iqbal and his team, forensic analyst Dr. Renee Calder, and the medical examiner's painstaking work, the truth might have remained submerged indefinitely. The psychological profile of Nolan began to crystallize for Morales. He had been methodical, patient, calculating. He had lived for decades with the knowledge of what he had done, watching the news, following anniversaries, collecting articles in quiet compulsion. It wasn't remorse that drove him, it was obsession. Control, a private acknowledgement of power over life and death. The newspaper clippings found under his bed were trophies of a mind that could compartmentalize evil from the banal routines of everyday life. He had walked past neighbors, shopped at the grocery store, nodded politely to the barista, all while keeping a dark secret buried within him. Meanwhile, the Hale family struggled with the paradox of relief and horror. Relief that someone was finally in custody, that the mystery would not remain eternal. Horror that the man responsible had not only gone unpunished, but had integrated seamlessly into their community. The trauma that began with the disappearance continued in a new form. The knowledge that the cruelty of the world sometimes hides behind ordinary faces, behind the most unremarkable lives. Mark Hale, staring at the television coverage, reflected on years of sleepless nights, missed work, and the empty chair at family dinners. Every decision, every memory of his children had been shadowed by absence. Now, the story had an ending, but the emotional scars remained, fresh as ever. Morales understood that closure wasn't instantaneous. Arrest was only the beginning. The families needed to know that this quiet, ordinary man would be held accountable, that the painstaking forensic work, the witness testimonies, the chain of evidence were not just procedural, they were instruments of justice designed to honor lives unjustly taken. She also realized that public engagement was essential. For decades, cold cases went unsolved not because of negligence but because of limitations in technology, human error, or the absence of critical witnesses. If viewers or the community remembered one lesson from the Hale case, it was the importance of persistence. She wanted people to understand that silence from a criminal doesn't erase guilt, and that sometimes decades-old truths can finally surface. Community members were still processing the shock. Conversations at coffee shops, diners, and local markets revolved around the reality of the crime, the ordinariness of the perpetrator, and the painstaking detective work that brought answers. Many were horrified that a man so seemingly innocuous could commit such calculated violence, yet the evidence left no room for doubt. In small towns, the story hit close to home. Neighbors recognized Nolan, co-workers recounted small interactions, and the collective disbelief gave way to cautious acknowledgement. A predator had lived among them for decades. As the investigation progressed, Morales and her team worked tirelessly to ensure every aspect of evidence collection and documentation was flawless. Nolan's interrogation remained silent, but the layers of evidence were undeniable. DNA from the tire iron conclusively tied him to the crime. Paint transfer linked his vehicle to the Hale Camry. Witness statements corroborated his presence near Los Lunas and along Route 47 on the night of the disappearance. Trauma analysis indicated the violent nature of the murders, consistent with homicide rather than an accident. Every piece fit into a mosaic that told the story in excruciating clarity. Amid the forensic rigor and procedural grind, Morales made sure the families remained informed. Every update was delivered with empathy, every question answered patiently. Mark and Evelyn were encouraged to revisit old memories, to share stories of Jonathan and Rebecca, to reinforce the humanity behind the case. This was part of healing, part of restoring a narrative that had been hijacked by silence and absence for over 4 decades. The detectives subtly encouraged public awareness too, understanding that community vigilance could help prevent similar tragedies. "Remember," she often said in interviews, "justice doesn't have an expiration date. Even when hope seems lost, persistence, observation, and courage can bring truth to light." The press coverage amplified the case's lessons. Anchors emphasized the importance of forensic advancements, community tips, and the relentless pursuit of justice by law enforcement. The narrative underscored how ordinary individuals could hide extraordinary violence. Viewers were left with a mix of horror and fascination, encouraged to engage, share, and reflect on the hidden complexities within their own communities. Morales understood that curiosity could transform into action. Citizens reporting suspicious activity, families insisting on follow-ups for missing loved ones, and a societal awareness that vigilance mattered. She subtly infused a call to action in every public update. Stay informed, stay observant, and never let a disappearance fade into silence. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mesa and the shadows stretched across the desert, Nolan was led into the transport vehicle for transfer to Bernalillo County. His face remained neutral, inscrutable, but his eyes betrayed an awareness that his carefully constructed life had come undone. Morales watched from a distance, thinking about the decades of unanswered questions, the grief, and the slow march of justice. She thought about the Hale family, about the sacrifices made by detectives, forensic scientists, and even ordinary community members who remembered details others had dismissed. Justice, she reflected, is often incremental, painstaking, and delayed, but when it arrives, it carries the weight of truth, accountability, and closure. For Mark Hale and Evelyn Brooks, the arrest was both vindication and torment. They had lived decades in limbo, clinging to hope, enduring the absence of answers, and now, the same questions that haunted them were being confronted head-on. Their grief was layered with a strange sense of release, knowing that the perpetrator could no longer walk among them unnoticed. Their children's memories were finally honored, and yet, the profound injustice that had stolen years of shared life lingered in every reflection, every silent corner of their home. And in the community, a palpable shift had occurred. Conversations turned from shock to contemplation. Parents discussed the unseen dangers lurking behind ordinary appearances. Friends reflected on the importance of community observation and vigilance. Every person who had dismissed a seemingly trivial act of aggression, every witness who had not been listened to decades ago, suddenly understood the broader consequences of silence. Morales knew that this awareness, combined with the meticulous work that had brought Nolan into custody, could prevent future tragedies, or at the very least, empower people to act before moments of horror became decades-long mysteries. For anyone watching, following the case, or hearing about it for the first time, there was a powerful takeaway. Vigilance matters. Persistence matters. Never let the unanswered, the unexplained, or the overlooked fade into silence. The Hale case proved that even after 42 years, the truth can surface, the guilty can be held accountable, and families can finally receive some measure of closure. The story urged viewers to subscribe, to stay informed, to follow cases where time may have eroded attention but not justice, and to understand that the smallest observations, the quietest memories, could one day bring answers that seemed impossible. Justice was far from complete. Nolan still faced the full weight of the legal system, the trial, and the consequences of his decades-old crimes. But for the Hale family, the most important battle had begun. Their children's names were no longer just a haunting question mark, but the centerpiece of a narrative that had finally found its resolution. And for the community, the story of an ordinary man capable of extraordinary evil served as both warning and testament to the enduring power of persistence, forensic science, and moral courage. The sun fully set over Belen, casting long shadows across Nolan's now empty home and the quiet streets. In the offices of the Valencia County Sheriff's Department, investigators reviewed the evidence once more, meticulously ensuring that no detail had been overlooked. In quiet moments, Morales reflected on the path that had led here. Droughts revealing the Camry, forensic breakthroughs extracting DNA decades old, witnesses finally remembered, and a suspect who, despite decades of outward normalcy, could no longer hide behind the mundane. For anyone still doubting the power of truth, the Hale case stood as a profound reminder. No crime is truly buried forever. No injustice lasts beyond the relentless pursuit of those unwilling to give up. And for viewers, listeners, and readers following the story, it was a call to remain alert, engaged, and committed to remembering that every disappearance matters, every family matters, and every life deserves justice, even if it takes 42 years to achieve. June 17, 1989, started like any other summer evening in Valencia County, New Mexico. The air was warm and dry, carrying the faint scent of dust from the surrounding desert plains. In the heart of Los Lunas, Jonathan Michael Hale and Rebecca Hale were finishing dinner at Los Lunas, a cozy family-owned restaurant that had been a fixture in town for decades. Jonathan, a civil engineer in his late 20s, had a calm, practical demeanor, a quiet ambition that was reflected in his meticulous approach to life. Rebecca, his wife, was 25, a teacher at a local elementary school, warm, radiant, and full of life. They had been married just under a year, in July 1988, and for anyone who knew them, they were the picture of young happiness. Their dinner had been ordinary, a shared plate of grilled chicken and vegetables, laughter over inside jokes, subtle planning for a future together, perhaps a home of their own, maybe a family. Outside, the sun was dipping behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the streets of Los Lunas. Jonathan paid the bill, Rebecca retrieved her coat, and together they stepped into the evening, blissfully unaware that this night would mark the beginning of a nightmare that would last for decades. As they left the restaurant, a man sitting near the back of the dining room glanced up, his attention momentarily caught by Rebecca's laughter. Thomas Ray Nolan, 27 at the time, was sitting alone at a booth, nursing a beer, his dark hair slightly unkempt, his eyes lingering longer than was polite. On the surface, he appeared ordinary, just another man out for a quiet drink after work. But beneath the veneer of normalcy, Nolan carried a simmering temper, a fixation on control, and a dangerous obsession with the women who rejected him. That night, he noticed Rebecca. She didn't see him, didn't know that someone was watching. Jonathan and Rebecca slid into their beige Toyota Camry and began their drive along Route 47, heading toward Cedar Lake Reservoir for a short weekend getaway. It was a familiar road, dotted with desert shrubs and occasional ranches, the kind of drive that should have been uneventful, tranquil even. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. A dark vehicle had been trailing them at a distance, its headlights catching the Camry in the rearview mirror. That vehicle, later determined to be Nolan's Ford F-150, maintained its distance, patient, silent, biding time. Minutes passed. Jonathan slowed slightly to navigate a curve. Suddenly, the truck accelerated, closing the gap, forcing the Camry to swerve off the pavement. Tires skidded across loose gravel, dust plumes rising into the night air. Jonathan struggled to regain control, but it was too late. The car left the road near a narrow access route leading to Cedar Lake, trees brushing against the side panels, branches scraping along the vehicle. Panic surged as Rebecca screamed, her voice cutting through the night. And then came the attack, brutal, swift, and merciless. By the time the Toyota finally rested at the edge of the reservoir, silence had returned, broken only by the faint lapping of water. Thomas Nolan had carried out the crime with a chilling calm, ensuring that no immediate trace would lead back to him. He had lived in the area long enough to know the terrain, the hidden corners where a car could vanish, submerged in water and sediment. That night, 2 young lives were extinguished, and the vehicle, along with its occupants, disappeared beneath the surface of Cedar Lake Reservoir, leaving only questions and heartbreak in its wake. The following morning, panic set in when the Hales failed to return home. Mark Hale, Jonathan's older brother, and Evelyn Brooks, Rebecca's mother, were among the first to sense that something was terribly wrong. Calls to neighbors, attempts to trace the couple's steps, and a frantic visit to the Los Lunas police station led to the filing of missing persons reports. Sheriff's deputies combed Route 47 and surrounding areas, yet no car, no evidence, no hint of struggle was found. Search parties formed, volunteers scoured the roadsides and desert expanses, but the Camry was gone, as if swallowed by the earth. Investigators quickly realized the limitations they faced. It was 1989. Forensic DNA analysis was still in its infancy. Surveillance cameras were rare, and witness accounts were often incomplete or inconsistent. All the law enforcement could rely on were shoe-leather investigations, interviews, and hope. The frustration was palpable. Families pleaded for answers, but months turned into years with no leads. Mark Hale and Evelyn Brooks became relentless advocates, attending town meetings, speaking to local media, and ensuring that Jonathan and Rebecca's names were never forgotten. Yet the pain of uncertainty never waned. As the years rolled on, the story of the Hales became a quiet, persistent shadow over Valencia County. Thomas Nolan lived a life designed to blend in. Outwardly, he was ordinary. A construction foreman, polite to neighbors, helpful in small-town interactions, attending the occasional church function, stopping at local diners and bars where familiar faces nodded at him without knowing the darkness he harbored. He lived in Belen, New Mexico, moving quietly through decades, leaving behind a paper trail of minor arrests and incidents, bar fights in the early 90s, a domestic assault in 1994, a DUI in 2003, but nothing that connected him to the disappearance of the Hales. Each arrest was brief, inconsequential in the eyes of the community, his public persona intact. Yet beneath that facade, Nolan collected subtle reminders of the Hales' fate. Newspaper clippings from initial reports, anniversary pieces, occasional follow-up articles, all carefully preserved, tucked away in shoeboxes, quietly reinforcing an obsession that had begun decades earlier. For 4 decades, he watched from the shadows, ensuring no one ever suspected him, living a double life in plain sight. Meanwhile, the families endured the slow, grinding reality of grief. Birthdays came and went. Mark Hale pursued his career but never stopped searching, attending cold case conferences, filing follow-up inquiries with law enforcement, and speaking to anyone who might remember a detail from that night. Evelyn Brooks organized memorials for her daughter, keeping Rebecca's memory alive through community events and quiet remembrances at home. The pain of not knowing, the void left by unanswered questions, became a constant companion. The Hales' story was a cautionary tale whispered in small-town corridors, a reminder that sometimes evil wears a mask of ordinariness. Everything changed in September 2021. A severe drought had lowered the waters of Cedar Lake Reservoir to levels unseen in decades. Fishermen, accustomed to the lake's usual boundaries, began noticing odd protrusions beneath the murky surface. Danny Morrison, a local angler with decades of experience on the lake, was the first to spot something unusual. At first, he thought it was a log or a pile of rocks, but as he maneuvered his boat closer, the outline of a vehicle emerged. Rusted, barnacled, and submerged at the shallow edge, It was unmistakably human-made. He called local authorities, shaking as he recounted what he'd seen. The New Mexico State Police responded cautiously. A dive team was assembled to confirm the sighting, wary of potential hazards. As divers approached, the rusted shape revealed itself as a 1987 Toyota Camry, its windows shattered, algae coating every inch of the exterior. The reality hit the Hales family with a mixture of dread and relief. Mark and Evelyn received the news simultaneously, and their reactions were instantaneous. Tears, disbelief, and a flurry of urgent calls to loved ones. This was the moment they had waited decades for, yet the confirmation also reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Recovery operations were painstaking. The Camry had been underwater for 32 years, sediment-filled and fragile. Cables and winches were used to carefully extract the vehicle without dislodging potential evidence. Forensic specialists, including Dr. Samuel Iqbal and Dr. Renee Calder, were brought in to examine the remains. Skeletal analysis revealed trauma consistent with violent assault, not accidental submersion. Tire irons found in the trunk held traces of blood, and DNA analysis, though challenging given the decades of decay, yielded crucial matches. These breakthroughs confirmed that the vehicle and its contents were indeed the Hales. Modern forensic techniques allowed investigators to extract DNA from the tire iron and compare it against national databases. Paint transfer from an older Ford F-150, matched to Thomas Nolan's vehicle registrations in 1989, linked the suspect to the crime scene. Witness re-interviews corroborated timelines, placing Nolan near Los Lunas on the night of the disappearance, frequently at diners and bars where Rebecca had been seen prior to that fateful evening. Route reconstruction showed how the Toyota had been forced off the road into Cedar Lake, leaving no question about the deliberate nature of the act. With mounting evidence, the stage was set for an arrest. Detective Elena Morales led a small tactical team to Nolan's residence in Belen in 2024. The house was modest, unassuming, with sparse furniture and the quiet appearance of a man living a simple life. Nolan opened the door calmly, his demeanor shockingly ordinary. There was no dramatic outburst, no flight, only an eerie stillness. Officers read him his rights, placed him in handcuffs, and led him to the cruiser as neighbors looked on, stunned. A search of Nolan's home revealed boxes of newspaper clippings detailing the Hales' disappearance and subsequent coverage. It was a collection spanning decades, quietly maintained, reinforcing his obsession and linking him psychologically to the crime. In the interrogation room, Detective Morales laid out the evidence: DNA matches, paint transfer analysis, forensic trauma reports, and witness testimony placing Nolan near the victims. Yet he remained silent, requesting only a lawyer. His calm, composed facade remained intact, a chilling contrast to the horrific crime he had committed decades earlier. The press and community reacted with disbelief. How could someone so ordinary, polite, and helpful harbor such darkness? Mark Hale and Evelyn Brooks finally had an answer to a question that had haunted them for 36 years. They met with investigators, offered statements to the press, and spoke candidly about the decades-long pain of uncertainty. The story of the Hales became a cautionary tale. Evil can wear the mask of normalcy, and vigilance, persistence, and modern technology are crucial in uncovering the truth. By 2025, the legal process culminated in Thomas Nolan's conviction. Bernalillo County District Court oversaw the proceedings, including testimonies from forensic experts, law enforcement officers, and community members. Detailed evidence linked Nolan to the crime with irrefutable clarity. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The Hales family experienced a mixture of relief and grief. A chapter closed, yet the memory of Jonathan and Rebecca would never fade. Mark Hale and Evelyn Brooks organized a small memorial at Cedar Lake, reflecting on the lives lost and the journey toward justice. The lake, once a place of terror and unanswered questions, now symbolized remembrance and closure. Investigators reflected on the case's trajectory, from the limitations of 1989 to the technological breakthroughs of the 2020s, highlighting the importance of persistence, science, and human dedication in solving cold cases. The broader lesson was clear. Cold cases are never truly cold. Ordinary individuals can harbor extraordinary evil. Families of missing persons deserve answers, and with patience and modern forensic science, justice can be delivered, even decades later. Jonathan and Rebecca Hale are remembered not just as victims but as people who lived, loved, and deserved so much more. Their story underscores the value of never giving up, the importance of vigilance, and the power of science combined with human determination. Thank you for joining us in uncovering stories hidden in the shadows. Every victim deserves to be remembered. Every truth deserves to be told. To follow more cold cases, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share these stories. Your support helps keep their voices alive.